Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. My wife Hannah and I have lived in our suburban home for almost 12 years now. We've poured our hearts into making it our perfect little oasis, complete with a beautiful garden, a cozy patio, and a small pool where our kids can splash around during summer. We've always had great relationships with our neighbors, until George moved in next door last spring. At first, George seemed normal enough. He was a guy in his mid-50s who kept to himself mostly. He'd wave occasionally when getting his mail, but that was about it. No big deal. Not everyone needs to be best friends with their neighbors. But things started getting weird about 3 months after he moved in. It began with him constantly peering over the fence whenever we were in our backyard. He'd just stand there, watching us like some creepy statue. If we noticed him and waved, he'd quickly duck down and disappear. After a few weeks of this, Hannah started feeling really uncomfortable about letting our kids swim or play outside. "I don't like the way he watches us," she told me one evening. "It's like he's studying everything we do." I decided to try talking to him about it. One Saturday morning, I walked over and knocked on his door. George answered wearing what looked like military-grade binoculars around his neck. "Hey, George," I said, trying to keep things friendly. "I wanted to chat with you about something that's been bothering us a bit." He barely opened the door. "What is it?" "Well, we've noticed you watching our family a lot when we're in our yard. It's making my wife and kids uncomfortable. I'm sure you don't mean anything by it, but I have every right to look wherever I want for my property," he snapped, cutting me off. "If you don't like it, stay inside." Then he slammed the door in my face. I stood there stunned for a moment. So much for the diplomatic approach, but that confrontation was just the beginning of our problems with George. A week later, I came home from work to find construction materials piled in his driveway, lumber, metal brackets, and what looked like sections of prefab walls. I had a bad feeling about this, but figured maybe he was just building a shed or something. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of power tools and hammering. When I looked out our bedroom window, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. George had contractors building what looked like a watchtower on his roof. It was a wooden structure about 8 feet tall rising from the peak of his house, with windows on all 4 sides looking down at the surrounding properties. I immediately called the city's building department. "Hi, I need to report some concerning construction happening next door," I told the clerk. "My neighbor is building some kind of observation tower on his roof. Does he have permits posted?" she asked. I walked outside to check. I don't see any permits displayed. "What's the address?" "I'll look it up in our system." After giving her George's address, she confirmed what I suspected. He hadn't applied for any building permits. She said she'd send an inspector out right away. The inspector showed up about 2 hours later. By then, the basic frame of George's tower was already up. The inspector took one look at it and started writing in his notebook, shaking his head. George came storming out of his house. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. The inspector barely glanced up from his notes. "Sir, I'm from the city building department. This structure appears to be unauthorized. I need to see your building permits and plans." "I don't need permits," George shouted. "This is my house and I can build whatever I want." "That's not how this works," the inspector replied calmly. "All structural additions require proper permits and must meet building codes. This will need to come down immediately." George's face turned red. "Like hell it will! I'm building this tower to protect the neighborhood. These people," he pointed at my house, "are suspicious. Someone needs to keep an eye on them." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The inspector looked from George to me with raised eyebrows. "Sir, are you saying you're building this structure specifically to observe your neighbors?" "They're up to something," George insisted. "I've seen them in their yard at all hours, moving around suspiciously." "You mean when we're swimming in our pool or gardening?" I interjected. "Normal things people do in their own backyard?" The inspector held up his hand to stop our argument. "Mr. George, I'm issuing a stop work order. This construction must cease immediately until proper permits are obtained. You have 72 hours to remove what's already been built or face daily fines." He stuck the bright orange stop work order to George's front door. George ripped it down immediately. "This is harassment," he yelled. "I have rights. I'll sue the city." The inspector just shrugged. "That's your prerogative, but this structure is coming down one way or another. I thought that would be the end of it." But over the next few days, George and his contractors kept working on the tower despite the stop work order. Every time an inspector came by, George would claim they were just securing the structure, not actively building. But it kept getting taller and more elaborate. Finally, the tower was finished, a 2-story wooden monstrosity rising from his roof like some kind of dystopian guard post. The windows were fitted with what looked like rotating cameras, and George installed bright floodlights that he'd shine into our yard at night. That's when I decided to get serious about fighting back. I contacted Susan Wood, a lawyer friend who specialized in property disputes and privacy laws. "This is actually perfect timing," Susan told me when we met. "The city just passed new ordinances about residential surveillance and privacy rights. Your neighbor is violating several of them." She helped me document everything. Photos of the tower's construction despite the stop work order, videos of George's cameras tracking our movements, light readings showing his floodlights exceeding permitted levels. We also got statements from other neighbors who felt uncomfortable with George's surveillance tower looming over their properties. We filed complaints with multiple city departments, building code enforcement, zoning board, police department. Each violation came with its own potential fines and penalties, but George remained defiant, convinced he was some kind of neighborhood watchman protecting everyone from imaginary threats. Things came to a head when he started posting photos taken from his tower on the neighborhood Facebook group, adding bizarre commentary about our family's suspicious activities, which were really just normal things like having friends over for BBQs or our kids playing in the pool. That's when Susan suggested we sue him directly for harassment and privacy violations. We filed the lawsuit along with an emergency motion for injunctive relief to force him to take down the tower immediately. The day of the emergency hearing, George showed up representing himself, carrying a stack of grainy surveillance photos he claimed proved we were dangerous elements in the neighborhood. The judge was not impressed. "Mr. George," she said after reviewing our evidence, "you've violated multiple building codes, ignored stop work orders, and apparently built this structure for the express purpose of spying on your neighbors. Do you have any legitimate defense for these actions?" "Your Honor, I'm performing a vital security service," George insisted. "These people are suspicious. Look at these photos. They're always outside, moving around, clearly plotting something." The judge peered at his photos. "Sir, these appear to be pictures of a family using their pool and having backyard gatherings. There's nothing suspicious about that." "But they could be doing anything out there," George protested. "Someone needs to watch them." "No, Mr. George, they don't need to be watched. They have a reasonable expectation of privacy in their own backyard." The judge set down his photos. "I'm granting the injunction. You have 14 days to completely remove this illegal structure. You'll also pay all fines levied by the city, and I'm ordering you to cease all surveillance of your neighbors." George started to protest, but the judge cut him off. "Additionally, I'm issuing a restraining order barring you from photographing or recording your neighbor's properties. If you violate this order, you'll be subject to criminal penalties. Do you understand?" George slumped in his chair, finally seeming to realize how serious this was. "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered. The next 2 weeks were incredibly satisfying. Professional contractors came to dismantle George's tower piece by piece. The city made him restore his roof to its original condition and pay for inspections to ensure it was structurally sound. Between the fines, legal fees, and construction costs, his ill-conceived spy tower ended up costing him over $50,000. The best part? George put his house up for sale a month later. Apparently, living next to the suspicious family he wasn't allowed to spy on anymore was too much for him to handle. We later learned from his real estate agent that George had been forced to retire early from his job as a security guard due to psychological concerns, which explained a lot about his paranoid behavior. I almost felt bad for him, but then remembered all the stress and anxiety he'd caused our family. The new neighbors who bought his house are a lovely young couple who actually asked permission before installing a privacy fence between our properties. What a concept! These days, our backyard is back to being the peaceful oasis we always wanted. Our kids can play freely without feeling watched, and Hannah and I can enjoy our garden without worrying about being photographed and labeled as suspicious characters on social media. I still can't believe we had to go through all that drama just to maintain our basic privacy rights, but at least we got a crazy story out of it, and an intimate knowledge of local building codes that I hope I'll never need to use again. Edit. Wow, this really blew up. Thanks for all the supportive comments. To answer some common questions. 1. Yes, George really built this tower without any permits or architectural plans. The building inspector said it was a miracle it didn't collapse. 2. The total cost to George was actually closer to $75,000 when you include the legal fees, contractor costs, and loss he took on selling his house quickly. 3. Our lawyer is pursuing having his illegal surveillance photos removed from social media, but it's a slow process. 4. Several people have asked about George's current whereabouts. Last we heard, he moved to a remote property in the mountains where he can build all the watchtowers he wants. Update. It's been 6 months since my original post, and wow, has a lot happened. I wanted to share some interesting developments that really bring this whole crazy saga full circle. First off, remember those surveillance photos George posted on social media? Well, our lawyer Susan finally got them all taken down, but not before they led to an unexpected twist. Turns out one of George's creepy photos actually helped solve a real crime. Just not the kind he was imagining. In the background of one picture, you could see our elderly neighbor Mrs. Johnson's caregiver stealing jewelry from her house. Mrs. Johnson's family had suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove it. They showed George's photo to the police, who used it to arrest the caregiver. She confessed to stealing thousands of dollars worth of valuables over several months. I guess George's paranoid surveillance was good for something after all, Susan joked when she told me about it. Though I'm pretty sure watching out for actual criminals wasn't what he had in mind. Speaking of George, we finally found out what prompted his obsession with building that tower. His ex-wife reached out to me through Facebook after seeing my original post. Apparently, George had a mental breakdown after catching her having an affair, which she was conducting in their backyard while he was at work. After their divorce, he became fixated on the idea that all his neighbors were hiding similar secrets. I tried to get him help, she told me, but he was convinced he needed to monitor everyone around him to prevent being betrayed again. I'm just glad he finally got caught before his paranoia hurt someone. The most satisfying update involves George's house. Remember that nice young couple who bought it? Well, they're actually environmental engineers, and they've transformed his former surveillance tower site into something amazing. They installed solar panels and a rooftop garden where that monstrosity used to be. They even invited our kids to help plant vegetables up there. We wanted to turn something negative into a positive for the whole neighborhood, Dave, the husband, explained. Instead of looking down on people, we're helping look out for the environment. The garden has become a neighborhood attraction. Several other houses on our street are now adding their own solar panels and rooftop gardens. Even our grumpiest neighbor, old Mr. Peterson, asked for help setting up a tomato planter on his garage roof. As for George himself, well, karma works in mysterious ways. Remember how I mentioned he moved to a remote mountain property? Apparently, he tried to build an even bigger observation tower up there, but he didn't account for the high winds at elevation, and the whole thing came crashing down in a storm just one day after he finished it. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but he did get hit with another round of fines and building code violations. The last we heard, he's given up on towers altogether and is now living in a single-story cabin. His new neighbors are mostly deer and squirrels, who probably don't care much about being watched. Our neighborhood has really come together after all this drama. We started a community watch program, a legitimate one with proper training and coordination with local police. Turns out you don't need an illegal watchtower to help keep your neighborhood safe. Who knew? Hannah and I finally finished the backyard renovation project we'd put on hold during all the tower drama. We added a pergola and some privacy landscaping, though not to hide from prying eyes anymore, just because it looks nice. Our kids are back to enjoying the pool without worry, and this summer we hosted the neighborhood's first annual backyard BBQ festival. Looking back, it's crazy to think how one person's paranoia created such chaos in our lives, but in the end, it brought our community closer together and taught us all some valuable lessons about privacy, mental health, and the importance of proper building permits. Oh, and one final ironic twist. Our neighborhood just won Community of the Year from the City Council, partly thanks to all those rooftop gardens that sprouted up in the wake of George's tower debacle. Sometimes the best things really do grow from the strangest situations. The next one is a pro-revenge story. This one is not technically my revenge, but some revenge I got to see up close and take joy from and slightly participate in. The background is most of the story, so this will be a little long. Trigger warning for self-harm. I was in the Navy and stationed on the submarine base in Connecticut. I had a friend I met in boot camp, and we were in the same class for our A school, Navy job training. We'll call that friend Bill. Now, Bill wasn't the most physically fit guy. He was short, kind of chubby, and wore glasses. However, Bill was really smart, and as the sonar technician he was meant to be, he would have been amazing. He had a pragmatic way of looking at things I really valued in a friend, and I know it would have made him successful if he had made it out to the fleet. While in school, we had a couple of petty officers that were hard asses. They somehow convinced themselves they were super soldiers, despite the fact that our jobs in that field are really nerd-centric. You get picked for that job because of your math and computer skills, not your deadlift number. Still, they were both all about being fit and working out all the time. We would do physical training 3 times a week, and while most of us could keep up, Bill often fell behind on runs or didn't quite meet what these two idiots believed to be the standard. To be clear, Bill did pass the minimum requirements for fitness. He just didn't go as extreme as these guys. Side note for other Navy vets, he got the MC Pond coin for how hard he pushed himself at PT the day he visited. The end result was that they would constantly berate and belittle Bill. They'd call him fat, lazy, and everything else. They'd tell him he should kill himself, you name it. They were always on his ass despite him passing his assessments. At some point, Bill pushed himself too hard and injured his knee. He told these petty officers he was injured and had been seen by the doc on base. The doc had put him on light duty so the knee could recover. He had the paperwork to back it up. They elected to ignore that and threaten him with kicking him out if he didn't do the workouts. So Bill kept pushing himself, injuring himself more, and his mental health degraded the whole time. In my time in the Navy, you didn't get mental health services really. The only person to talk to like that was the chaplain. For those who don't know, the chaplain is the religious leader, usually a pastor/priest/rabbi that has signed up as a commissioned officer. Our chaplain was the sweetest little woman you ever met, but as a chaplain, she held the rank of captain, high-ranking officer. So Bill set up a meeting with the chaplain to talk about things. When Bill informed the petty officers he would be missing class the next day for his chaplain meeting, they yelled at and berated him more. They called him a pussy, useless, not fit for the Navy, and everything else you can imagine. They convinced Bill he was being weak and the chaplain wouldn't care about his issues, that nobody would care. They promised to make life even harder if he didn't show the next day, so he canceled his meeting. Evidently, bad luck hit, and that night his girlfriend was also breaking it off with him. She wasn't worth his time or money, but he couldn't see that. That night I awoke to a 3 a.m. call from Bill. I couldn't hear anything, and I asked several times, "Bill, you there? Are you okay?" It wouldn't have been the first time that I got a drunk dial from one of my friends after a hard day like Bill had. Sailors have been known to drown their sorrows a bit. Eventually I figured it was a butt dial/drunk dial and hung up and went back to bed. I still regret that decision. The next day, all hell broke loose. Me and a couple other friends got calls from Bill's now ex-girlfriend informing us he was in the hospital because he slit his own throat. Turned out a few of us got that 3 a.m. call, but Bill couldn't speak at the time and was kind of out of it due to blood loss. We finished what we had to do on base and rushed over to the hospital. As we got there, the chaplain was on her way out and we passed her in the hallway. She spoke to us briefly to say that Bill would be okay and she wouldn't forget this. I have never seen a look on someone's face that so accurately depicted raw, unfiltered rage. It took us all by surprise because she was such a small, sweet, and personable lady. But the look in her eyes, you could just tell she wanted someone to pay for this. She wanted revenge, and we all knew she wore the kind of rank that could get it done. We visited Bill, who could barely talk, but he told us the story of what had happened, what he was thinking at the time, and how glad he was it didn't work. Apparently it was cold enough that the blood clotted on the outside of his neck and made a kind of patch that kept him alive long enough for the EMS to find him and get him to a hospital. The doctor said he missed his carotid by about a millimeter. A week went by and we hadn't heard anything until we got called in by the chief of the training command, the boss to these petty officers. He said he wanted to check on the rest of us and make sure there weren't any other issues with these guys he wasn't aware of, and that we were all okay. I let him know about an ass chewing he gave me a few months back, that I was really set up by these guys and they had lied to him. My friends cited a couple other examples of their own with these guys being generally shitty, dishonest people. I don't think it mattered. I think their fates were already sealed and we were being asked for more ammo to bury them with. The next day they were nowhere to be found and we were introduced to new instructors who would be taking over our training permanently. After class, I decided to stop by and ask the chaplain what happened. She told me she had never been more disgusted by the actions of a sailor than these two guys who convinced someone not to come see her. She teared up a bit, regretting that she didn't get the chance to help Bill before he made his attempt. In her mind, it was these two that precipitated and enabled Bill's attempt. So on to the revenge. The chaplain told me she went to the admiral in charge of the entire base and demanded their immediate discharge. He granted it. Both petty officers were immediately processed out with dishonorable discharges. I can't remember the exact charge I heard they cited for it, but I know the Navy has a way of selling BS on paper when they want a certain outcome, especially officers at that high level. So basically they get no VA benefits of any kind, got kicked out of the base housing they lived in, and could probably only find work at a gas station or under-the-table stuff somewhere. Also, I know from someone else who got the boot that the Navy only pays for a single bus ticket to get you back home, not your family or any of your belongings. When you have a discharge like that, no company with DoD contracts is allowed to hire you. That includes McDonald's because they have stores on bases throughout the country. Taco Bell, Subway, etc. None of them will give you a job. They can't and they don't want to anyway. So I don't know where these guys went or what become of them, but I know their lives were irrevocably ruined. One of them had about 18 years in, so he was 2 years from retirement and lost it all. The other was at about 12 years, so he also lost a lot. Wherever they are now, I'd be very surprised to hear they're making more than minimum wage. As for Bill, well, he made a full recovery. He got a full medical discharge, which is an honorable discharge that meant E5 pay for the rest of his life, full benefits, and a referral to a counselor in his home state once he got back there, all paid for by the Navy. We lost touch over the years, but I did see on Facebook he got himself together, became a police officer, and got married. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.